May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be mindful of thee, O Lord, my strength and my salvation. Amen. Would you please be seated? I want to talk to you this morning about our gospel reading and take the time to talk about what I call the Protestant doctrine of Mary. Now, many people who come to Shepherd of the Hills are not from the Episcopal tradition. We have people from just about every Christian background and tradition. And we all sort of come in with our own understanding and presuppositions, and every so often I'll say something or I'll make a point, and someone will after me say, well, that doesn't sound right because I was taught this. Well, the tradition of the Episcopal Church is that of the Reformed Catholic Church. Now, what does that mean, Reformed Catholic? It means we share the teachings of the undivided universal church, the things that everybody agrees on. But then, when things over the past 400 or 500 years, when each little denomination took its own course, we may not necessarily, we'll say, that sounds like a good idea, but you don't have to believe it to be saved. And the biggest difference for some people coming to our church is that we look Catholic, we may sound Catholic. I introduced my wife, Susan, as my housekeeper to people. But what is the difference? Well, there are two primary differences. And really, there are only two. The first is the place of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. We say he's a real bishop, we give him honor, we give him pride of place, but he is not the head of our church. He is another bishop. He is an important bishop, but he has no, what we call, jurisdiction. So if the Pope says it, we can say, hey, that may be a good idea, but I don't have to do anything about it. The second are the doctrines of Mary. Now these are, if you will, controversial, because if you went to a Catholic parochial school, these were drummed into your head as a small child. And you just assume that this is the way it is. But it may not necessarily be shared by other people. Now, let me start off by saying, are you wrong if you believe in the Catholic doctrines of Mary? No, you're not. They are perfectly acceptable within the Anglican tradition. It's just that there are extra additional options, like white wall tires. Some people like them, some people don't. I know that may sound silly that Mary is a white wall tire, but let me explain where I'm coming from. The Catholic Church teaches that there are 4 dogmas. Now, what is a dogma? It is something you must believe in order to be saved. And there are 4 dogmas about Mary. Now, the first dogma of Mary is that she is the Mother of God. Now, that came in the 4th century. At an ecumenical council where all the Christian world at that time gathered and say, well, what do we mean by all these things? What do these creeds say? What is the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed? What do we understand about God? And one of the fights that they were having is, we read about Mary in the Gospels, we have these traditions of Mary, what exactly is she? And they came up with the word Theotokos, the God-bearer. In other words, and why not just say she's the Mother of God? Well, that's what we say in English. But because they wanted a technical term to describe her relationship. Because if you just say that she's the Mother of God without any explanation, wouldn't she be God too? I mean, in other words, it opens doors to places we didn't want to go. So the 4th century is the first doctrine that Mary is the Theotokos, the Mother of God, the bearer of God. Through her, Jesus came into this fleshy, physical world. He was born of her, a virgin. Now, 1,000 years pass. We have the starts of the Reformation in England and in Germany and France. And the Catholic Church, in response to the Reformation, began what was called the Counter-Reformation. This, for instance, is when the Jesuits were formed, and they were the shock troops of the Catholic Church to go out and say, this is what we believe. And so at this time, a number of doctrines that had been around maybe for up to 1,000 years were established. meaning that the Pope issued a decree saying, to be a Christian, you must believe this. And at the Council of Trent in 1555, the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary was propounded. Well, wasn't Mary a virgin? Yes. Didn't we read about this in the Bible? Yes. What is the perpetual virginity of Mary? That she was a virgin before she conceived, she was a virgin when she conceived, and then after she gave birth to Jesus, she remained a virgin. And she was perpetually a virgin all of her life. And this is something you must believe if you're a Catholic. Now, the Protestants at that time said, wait. We believe up to a point. Because we read about James, the brother of Jesus, in the Gospels. We read Mary and Jesus' brothers and sisters stood there and asked him to come away. We read about Jesus' family. How do we sort of square the Gospel accounts of Mary having other children, Mary being the wife of Joseph, Mary being, if you will, a normal Jewish woman in a family, with a teaching that she is perpetually virgin? Well, it's not in the Bible, but it sort of follows logically if you have an understanding of theology in a certain direction. So that's the second doctrine, dogma of Mary. And Protestants, many of them, do not accept it. Well, I think we all accept that Jesus was born of a virgin. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what happened afterwards. And that's a point of distinction. The third doctrine came about in 1854. Does any of you remember a 1940s movie starring Jennifer Jones called The Song of Bernadette? It's about a little French girl who has a vision of Mary in a grotto in a little French town called Lourdes. And one of the things this vision of the Virgin Mary says, I am Immaculate Conception. Well, what does that mean? It means, and it took off and was so powerful and so prominent in the Catholic world at that time, because at that exact moment, the Catholic Church was debating this concept of the Immaculate Conception. Which means that, well, how do we prevent Jesus from having original sin? Because if he had a human mother, and all humans have original sin, therefore he must have sin in him as well. So how do we get that Jesus was without sin if he had a human mother? And so the Catholic Church came up with a logical doctrine that Mary was conceived and without original sin. Now, that makes logical sense if you start with the premise that Jesus is without sin, and let's work backwards. But if you start with the Protestant way of thinking, let's start with the Bible and work forwards, it's not there. How can we say that? We can't make that argument. We can make it logically. You can infer this. 2 plus 2 equals 4, but it's not there. And this was a division point. And when we have our ecumenical debates with the Roman Catholic Church about what we believe and not believe, we usually wind up with these weaselly words at the end so that we can cover all bases and still at the same time agree not to agree. Well, I won't go into that, but the fourth doctrine of Mary. So, Mother of God, 4th century. Perpetual virginity, 1555. Immaculate Conception, 1854. The fourth doctrine of Mary was made in 1950. And that was the Assumption of Mary. Meaning that when Mary died, instead of rotting away, being cremated as a human body would, she was assumed into heaven as Christ was assumed into heaven. As we read Elijah disappearing in the whirlwind, Mary too did not suffer the taint of physical corruption. Now that you can make logical sense from, and I can see where they're coming from. What's the problem from a Protestant perspective? It's not in the Bible. It's added on. Now, recently, there was a Congress held at the instigation of the Vatican in 1993, I believe it was, to look whether we should have a fifth dogma of Mary. This was, is Mary a co-redemptress, mediator, and advocate? Now, what does that mean? That Mary, along with, is part of our salvation. That we need Mary just as much as we need Jesus. Just as, in other words, she's a junior member of the Trinity. She's not Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, she's Mom. Now, the Congress voted no. And it did so because the leader of this Congress was a man named Ratzinger, who later went on to become Pope, who said that this is a pious tradition. And there are practices within the Catholic world of people praying to Mary for Mary to intercede with her son Jesus. But that is a folk custom. It's not part of the teaching or traditions of the Catholic Church. Now, for a Protestant, this is screwy. Because our Jesus, as we will say in our Bible, in our communion service, is our only mediator and advocate. Meaning you don't need Mary to pray for you. You don't need the saints to pray for you. You've got Jesus. He is your mediator. He is your advocate. He is the only way to the Father, and you don't have to go through these other routes. Now, as you can tell by my thing, I come from the Protestant perspective. You go to St. Anne's in Crystal River, they're on the Catholic side of the Episcopal side. And they may have different perspectives. It doesn't mean that we're a better church and they're a worse church, and he's a better priest and I'm a worse priest. Well, that's a different topic. But the point is, within the Anglican world, we have a thing called liberty of conscience. We don't have a magisterium. Now, what's a magisterium? That is where the buck stops. The person who says, this is what you must believe in order to be a good Episcopalian. The Catholic Church has a magisterium. It's headed by the Pope, and he decides what goes. There have been some controversies within the Catholic Church this past year because the new Pope, new about 5 years now, Francis, has been sort of tearing up things. He said that capital punishment at all times and in all places is always wrong. Well, that's a belief. It's pious. You can defend it. Problem is, you've got 500 popes going back to before you saying capital punishment's okay. The papal states, when Italy was divided and the papacy had its own geographic area, up until the 1870s, when Italy was finally unified, there was capital punishment in the papal states under the authority of the Pope. In the 1940s, I think it was Pope Pius, and I forget the number. Pope Pius gave an official dogmatic statement saying that the state may execute people. That is a lawful use, a judicious use of power. This Pope says no. Now, if this were the Episcopal world, and the Archbishop and the presiding bishop in New York says, I can't stand capital punishment, it's a terrible thing, we'll go, that's nice. But I think, we're from Texas, let's fry him. No. We have a liberty of conscience. And how that works is that we have, but that stands not on whatever I say goes, but rather we begin with the Scriptures. That's the foundation. If you can't make an argument from the Bible, you don't have an argument. You have a pious belief, you have a good idea, but it's not something that you must believe in order to be Christian. And then we have the creeds, which you will are sort of the boundaries. They're the boundaries around which within our Christian world operates. So you can walk into this church as a Lutheran, as a Methodist, as a Baptist, as a Roman Catholic, and be totally at home doctrinally, theologically, because your beliefs are within the parameters of the creed. And if you have additional things that may not have a biblical warrant, I do not have the authority to say, oh, you poor dumb person. I may disagree with you, but you have a liberty of conscience to believe what you believe to be true. Now, there's good stuff, things about this, and bad things. Why did this happen? Because of the English Civil War. In the 16th century, we had the Puritans and we had the High Church and with the Anglo-Catholics, and everybody's killing each other. And we finally wind up killing the king. And the settlement that began with Elizabeth and finally was finished at the end of the 16th century was that we will agree to disagree. So in our Holy Communion service, you can believe in the real presence of Christ. What does that mean? That means that the body and blood are not just spiritually symbolizing Jesus Christ, but are actually his body, his blood. Because one of the prayers we say says that. And that prayer, the next paragraph, says this is spiritual. So if you pay attention, you can find, we cover both bases. And we do this because we're not going to settle this argument in this life. Once we die and we're in heaven, God can straighten us out. But until we get there, no one has the authority to say this and only this is the way forward. So on one hand, it's a very good argument because it allows latitude. It allows people to work together who may not agree on something. On the other hand, it's a terrible situation when you've got people who really are nuts. And in the past generation, I have talked to people who believe on abortion, on homosexuality, on women clergy, who think that people who disagree with them are going to go to hell. Now, they'll probably go to hell for other reasons. But we don't have anybody to say, let's stop fighting about homosexuality. This is the answer. Get over it. Nobody can say that to us. What we have is the Bible, and we stand on that. Now, we're called to study, to engage, to talk, so that over the course of time we come to a consensus. One of the great epics of the American Episcopal Church was also one of its most shameful as you think about it. During the Civil War, what happened to the Baptists? Split! Southern Baptists, American Baptists. What happened to the Methodists? Split! Methodists, Southern Methodists. About the Presbyterians, they split! Southern Presbyterians and the Presbyterians. There are no Catholics in the South at that time, but what about the Episcopal Church? We decided not to decide. We decided to wait to see who won the war. So the General Conventions of 1862 and 1865, when they called the roll, Alabama! Oh, I guess they're not coming this time. No, we just went on because the Episcopal, our diocese, was part of what was called the Episcopal Church in the Confederate States of America. And we had a separate church compared with the Northern Church, but then when the war was over, the same bishops who were the Confederate bishops decided, okay, war's over. We're going to forget the recent unpleasantness. Now, you would say that if you were a firm believer on the slavery issue, how could you be so wishy-washy? And that's a good, fair argument. Because today, I don't think there's anybody who would say the church should have sided for the slave faction. But at the time, the church in the South was quite convinced that God was on their side. So, there are good sides to it and bad sides to it. Because what I want you to take away from this is that at the end of the day, from this Protestant Episcopal perspective, it's nice to have our church. It's nice to have our traditions. It's nice to have me dressed like this with this voice that I spent 6 years learning how to get in graduate school. But at the end of the day, it's just you and Jesus. And you've got to decide. You've got to make the choice. You've got to have the final say in your own life. The church is here to accompany you on that journey, to help you, to train you, to work with you, to love you, to give you a leg up when you need it. But the church is not salvation. Christ is salvation. Mary, I said all these negative things that we don't believe. We think Mary is blessed. We think she's honored among all women. We think she is the best woman who ever was. We think wonderful things about Mary. Go to St. Mary's Church in Bellevue. I mean, half the churches seem to be named after St. Mary. It's not that we're negative about Mary, but it's the proper place and perspective. Because at the end of the day, what counts is you and God. The church is not the mediator. Mary is not the mediator. I'm not the mediator. Last night we had a baptism. We had Connor Fisher. Middle name is Wyatt. Connor Wyatt Fisher, 18 months old. And boy, did that kid squirm as I was trying to dunk him. I thought I'd drop him at one point. But it wasn't my magic fingers that had anything to do with anything. It was God, the power of the Holy Spirit. We have in our prayer book an actual rule on this point, which is that the worthiness of the minister does not have anything to do with the sacraments. Now, what does that mean? That means I could be a nasty SOB, I could be a drunk, I could be all these awful things, yet it has nothing to do with the work I am doing. Now, I don't think people would come, and I don't think I'd have a job, but your priest is not a perfect person. He's a man, he's a woman, with a calling, but he's not above. It is you and Jesus.